Our attachment to no nation upon earth should supplant our attachment to liberty. Liberty was the primary object. This comes from another declaration, one that was forgotten, mostly forgotten, from the American Revolution. It was written by Thomas Jefferson and John Dickinson. The Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms, which was unanimously passed by the Second Continental Congress a year before the Declaration of Independence. This is July 6th, 1775. I personally think it's one of the most important documents from the American Revolution, but surprise, surprise, it's almost completely forgotten. I certainly wasn't taught about this in high school, grade school, college, anywhere. It's many times just plain, just ignored completely. So today I've got some big highlights from this very important statement of principles and explanation. The revolutionaries absolutely denounced a so-called British peace offer that demanded gun control in exchange. They detailed some grievances against unlimited British power, and they built their case on a strong natural rights foundation. I'll get to all that in just a moment, but first of all, welcome and thank you for joining me here on the path to liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Monday, July 8th, 2024. Hope you had an awesome Independence Day week. I got a little bit less time working by not doing the show for the week, but I'm really excited to be back and share this information with you here today. But let's get right to it, and I think we need to start by backing up just a little bit for some of the context of where this came from. Now, I'm not going to go back to 1763 and, go right back to the beginning of the controversy or before that. But in the fall of 1774, after some back and forth stuff that had been going on for a number of years, the British launched a pretty aggressive gun control program. And here from an article that we published a little while ago, King George III issued a decree, I think this is around September of 1774, issued a decree blocking the importation of arms and ammunition to America without a permit. And what a surprise, no one ever got a permit. So one of these permission slip programs, anytime that the government says you need to get a permit to exercise a natural right, something that is your birthright, something that you have by the very nature of being a human. When they issue you a permit, this is a way that they can eventually control you by just saying, we're not going to issue any permits about that anymore. And that's exactly what the British did. All empires do this kind of stuff. We certainly see a lot today. Now, Lord Dartmouth, he repeatedly wrote to Governor and General Gage, pushing him to take things even further than this ban on importation. Here, for example, quote, upon no account suffer the inhabitants of at least the town of Boston to assemble themselves in arm on any pretense whatsoever, either of town guard or militia duty. So no carrying of firearms anymore. And this was very common, of course, at the time. Maybe it's not in Boston anymore. Another letter to Gage was even more aggressive. Quote, all cannon, small arms, and other military stores of every kind that may be either in any magazine or secreted for the purpose of aiding the rebellion should also be seized and secreted. So Dartmouth and Gage are making plans to not just ban importation of arms and ammunition, gunpowder, for example, but to go out and seize them. And Gage, of course, acted pretty quickly on this recommendation. He had, there was some conversation about this as well. But 4 days after that, getting that last letter, he issued orders that 700 or so troops were to assemble during the night for a mission to seize arms and gunpowder stored by the colonial militia at Concord. And we know what that was. April 19th, 1775, that was the shot heard round the world. I mean, that was the beginning of the intense fighting. And then just a few weeks later, on June 12th, 1775, less than 2 months after Lexington and Concord, Gage made an offer that he felt that the Americans couldn't refuse. Basically, give up your guns, give up your friends, and you can have peace, or at least, peace in his version, which is we will stop fighting with you. We will stop laying siege. We will stop blocking importation of whatever. But you have to all lay down your arms. So by July of 1775, we know that there was a full-blown war happening and a peace offer of sorts, at least, from the British to the revolutionaries. Now, the Second Continental Congress decided to take this up. John Hancock was the president of the Congress, and they asked Thomas Jefferson to write a resolution in response. John Dickinson did some rewriting of this, so they basically worked together to write the text. But instead of starting with an explanation right off the bat of why there were battles happening starting in April 19th, and rather than actually immediately getting to the so-called peace offer, they started with a foundational principle. This, quote, "If it was possible for men who exercise their reason to believe that the divine author of our existence intended a part of the human race to hold an absolute property in, and an unbounded power over others, marked out by his infinite goodness and wisdom as the objects of a legal domination never rightfully resistible, however severe and oppressive, the inhabitants of these colonies, it might at least require from the Parliament of Great Britain some evidence that this dreadful authority over them has been granted to that body." So this is some Jeffersonian and Dickinsonian flair. Dickinson, of course, was known as the penman of the American Revolution, absolutely famous and revered, at least up until this point. He had a little down point for a little while, but revered at this point for his letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania, the 12 letters against the Townshend Acts, which really established many or popularized many of the foundational principles of the American Revolution, built on a Lockean tradition based in self-ownership, consent, and property rights. But they're basically saying here, like, look, it's absurd to think that our creator would ever create a system where a certain part of humanity has total and complete domination over another part of humanity. And let's say you can prove it to us, but we haven't found anything in the British system where this ever was the case, because it was always different. And suddenly, a number of years ago, they started to shift things. Now, this was, of course, a clear reference to the Declaratory Act of 1766. This was passed, I believe it may have been the same day, if not was the following day, as the Stamp Act was repealed because of such aggressive resistance, non-compliance, the people's nullification of the Stamp Act. In response, they wanted to kind of just, it's a backhanded compliment. Okay, you guys succeeded, we'll get rid of this. But at the same time, we don't want to get you to think that you can get away with this kind of stuff, or that we agree that we're not authorized to implement the Stamp Act. And so we passed what was called the Declaratory Act, which is modeled after something that they passed against the Irish as well some years earlier. It claimed power over the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Now, surprisingly, and I've discussed this on another episode, Benjamin Franklin actually said, hey, if you guys do this, it'll be cool. Don't worry about it, because we know that in the past, it's just kind of a political posturing thing, and you don't really exercise that power. Now, John Adams was writing in his diary, he's like, I wonder how they're going to use this. He was expecting it to happen. Benjamin Franklin did absolutely flip within a few years and recognize this was absolutely horrible, and all the stuff that they did between 1766 and 74, etc., 1775, was in pursuance of that power over the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Now, I covered that in a full episode if you want a lot more detail. Now, of course, Thomas Jefferson, John Dickinson, the Second Continental Congress, at least by 1775, they vehemently rejected the notion that anybody could justly wield that kind of power over anyone else. And so they go to this. The legislature of Great Britain, however stimulated by an inordinate passion for power, not only unjustifiable, but which they know to be peculiarly reprobated by the very constitution of that kingdom. So, of course, the unwritten British constitution, which is the laws and the customs and the traditions, which was always that. The British basically had powers over war and foreign commerce and trade and things like that, among the various colonies and parts of the empire. And the colonies, this is kind of a precursor to what became the 10th Amendment. We see this very much from the principles of the American Revolution. All the stuff that affected the lives, fortunes, and property of the people would be handled on the colonial legislature basis as the people of each colony determined. Very much like what the 10th Amendment or Article 2, I believe it was Article 2 of the Articles of Confederation said. Hey, you guys get to do this stuff. Everything else is reserved to us here because we're the only ones that can determine what's best for us here. And having a far-off legislature make one-size-fits-all decisions for everyone is the very notion of a tyranny. It's just never going to work. So even though it was an unwritten British Constitution, they're pointing out, like, this is what we've always lived under, and now you're all of a sudden claiming unlimited power. Anyways, they were desperate of success in any mode of contest where regard should be had to truth, law, or right, have at length, deserting those, attempted to effect their cruel and impolitic purpose of enslaving these colonies by violence, and have thereby rendered it necessary for us to close with their last appeal from reason to arms. So we're getting close to discussing why the fighting is happening, but the underlying principle is that the British claim this power over the colonies in all cases whatsoever. And they're saying, well, there is a line in the sand, however unclear it may be, and that's why they wanted written constitutions at the time of the founding. But there is a line in the sand. And when you go beyond that, the people are supposed to resist. You are not bound to yield obedience to them, is how Patrick Henry, for example, put it in response to the Stamp Act. Anyways, they go further. Here's Dickinson and Jefferson. Yet, however blinded that assembly may be by their intemperate rage for unlimited domination, so to slight justice and the opinion of mankind, we esteem ourselves bound by obligations of respect to the rest of the world to make known the justice of our cause. So the whole point of having this declaration is to explain not to the British. They aren't begging from the British. They're giving a line in the sand to the British, and they will close, and it's pretty cool how they do it, saying, hey, yes, of course, the fighting can stop, but it's on you to make it stop. And then they're explaining to the world what's going on, so there's no confusion about this. Now, from there, the Declaration explained that a series of acts going back to around 1764, very likely the Sugar Act and then the Stamp Act, were examples of how the British were exercising this unlimited power. And they were certainly doing it for a few years, 1763, 4, and 5, before the Declaratory Act, but that's where they noticed the shift. And then when they passed that in 1766, they thought things were, at least many of them thought it was very, very serious. Here's how they put it. Parliament was influenced to adopt the pernicious project, and assuming a new power over them have, in the course of 11 years, given such decisive specimens of the spirit and consequences attending this power as to leave no doubt concerning the effects of acquiescence under it. TLDR, when a government body claims a bunch of power over you, well, it's really bad to submit to it because it's just going to keep building and it's going to keep getting worse. Thomas Paine, of course, discussed this in the American Crisis in December of 1776 in the dead of winter. It was certainly not looking really good, but he was basically saying, like, look, these are the times that try men's souls. That's how he kicked it off. But he said, you know, even if we think that they're making us a good deal at this point to stop the fighting, we have to keep pushing on because they're claiming this unlimited power over us, and no such power belongs to anyone on earth. Anyways, that's a very important point in this. I covered this a little bit more in an article we published over the weekend, and we actually have a list of grievances that came in this document as well. They did something very similar in the fall of 1774 in the Declaration and Resolves of the First Continental Congress. We know there was a list of grievances, technically abuses or injuries and usurpation. So usurpation, an exercise of power that violates the Constitution that was not authorized to government. So they had a much longer list the following year in the Declaration of Independence, but here are a few of them that they included in this one. They've undertaken to give and grant our money without our consent. So taking and spending the money without even being able to say yes or no to it. They extended the jurisdiction of the courts of admiralty and vice-admiralty beyond their ancient limits. They deprived us of the accustomed and inestimable privilege of trial by jury. They suspended the legislature of one of the colonies, interdicting all commerce to the capital of another, altering fundamentally the form of government established by charter. So if you think about the notion that the far-off government, the general or central, the federal government, even of today, is only authorized to exercise those powers delegated to it. Everything else is reserved to the people of the several states. Same type of structure under the British Empire, without as much, it wasn't really written down, but that's how it always played out. And that's what the colonists, the revolutionaries, expected at all times. And so soon as the government, the far-off government, started getting involved in internal taxes, that's really altering the entire structure of the system as well. They also exempted the murderers of colonists from legal trial and, in effect, from punishment, and the quartering of soldiers upon the colonists in time of profound peace. Now, instead of just continuing with a longer list, that's pretty comprehensive. There may have been one or two more that I didn't include in that list. So instead of doing that longer list, they decided to ask the obvious questions. This is the essential question. Quote, "But why should we enumerate our injuries in detail? What's the point of it? We don't have to list everything. Why? By one statute, it is declared that Parliament can of right make laws to bind us in all cases whatsoever." There's no point listing all the various things that they're doing to you that they shouldn't be doing in the first place if they still claim the power to do whatever they want. Because even if you can convince them to stop something like the Stamp Act or the Townsend Acts or the Tea Act, even if you can stop them from quartering troops, they still claim the power to do it all differently or the very same thing again. As long as they claim power in all cases whatsoever, there's no point in listing grievances. What is to defend us against so enormous, so unlimited a power? Unlimited power was the massive, massive problem. Now, the Declaration made clear that the colonists actually had been pleading for change for at least a decade. And they write, "We saw the misery to which such despotism would reduce us. We, for 10 years, incessantly and ineffectually besieged the throne as supplicants." On their knees, basically. They're pointing out, like, hey, we are doing our duty as subjects of the king, and we're telling you this is wrong. We know you're going to come in and stop this Parliament. But of course, George was not on board with that. Anyways, we reasoned, we remonstrated with Parliament in the most mild and decent language. Now, I'm sure the British would disagree with some of that. Now, instead of backing down and repealing everything in response to these petitions, they noted that the British instead, quote, "sent over fleets and armies to enforce them." So the more that they decided to resist, to not comply, the more that they decided to plead with them to stop, the more that the British decided to enforce. And that's where you had troops and General Gage roll in, and it gets worse and worse and worse. But loyalty only goes so far. They say, "We have pursued every temperate, every respectful measure. We have even proceeded to break off our commercial intercourse with our fellow subjects as the last peaceable admonition." We know that the Continental Association was passed by the First Continental Congress in late 1774. That was a series of ramp-ups of cutting off trade to impact, well, the British economic system, because they're like, man, we got to stay peaceful here still at this point. We're not going to fight until they actually physically attacked us, which is what happened in April of 1775, just some months later. But they're pointing out, like, we've tried literally everything. But our loyalty, again, can only go so far. And they put it this way: "Our attachment to no nation upon earth should supplant our attachment to liberty." So even though they were recognizing that they were basically on their knees pleading for a change, sooner or later there is a line in the sand. And it doesn't matter how loyal you are to your mother country, sooner or later you're going to take a stand when she is trying to harm you almost constantly. They continued with this: "This, we flattered ourselves, was the ultimate step of the controversy, that is, cutting off trade. We thought this was going to be a big deal." I think many of them figured this would have a far bigger impact. They probably didn't realize until a little bit later in the coming months, some letters were leaked about the gun control program. "This, we flattered ourselves, was the ultimate step of the controversy. But subsequent events have shown how vain was this hope of finding moderation in our enemies." Now, I'm going to link to this full declaration of causes in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Actually, Alan Mosley will be doing that. He organizes the blog post for every episode that we do. He includes all the links that I'm mentioning. Of course, I've got a couple of episodes, a few articles, the original source document approved by the Second Continental Congress, written by Thomas Jefferson and John Dickinson. You can probably even read a little bit more about who drafted which parts. Primarily, the last few paragraphs, they say, is mostly Jefferson's hands, and they're a little bit aggressive. And But they both had very kind words about each other, and I think they had a long friendship and a long period of respect for each other. Dickinson was far more moderate in how to approach things, hoping to reconcile, and Jefferson was a little bit more aggressive as well. But that'll be all linked to in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Alan will get that organized, and I'll get it published a couple of hours after this live stream is done. And while I'm here, I just want to take a quick moment and say hello to everyone out in the live chat. I really appreciate you being here. Whether you're here for the live show, I love the live show. Generally, I like when I'm listening to shows, I tend to lean towards the live production myself. So whether this is your first episode, you've been here for every single one since day one, whether you're live or in the archive, I don't care. I'm grateful because there'd be no point in me doing this if no one would ever listen. Maybe I'd do it for just a handful of people. That's how things started here at 10th Amendment Center. But hi to Gypsy Magic and Brewster and Gatto and a few others over on Rumble. I appreciate you joining me on that platform. There's Honeybee and Brewster and Merkin and Kirk and Jennifer and Sparrow and Howard and a few other people. There's Joshua. I'm just trying to scroll through here. Diana, good to see you. Mr. Greenbottle, White-Bearded Gnu. I know you love this document as much as I do, this declaration from July 6, 1775. So really good to see you as well. Anyways, I know I'm missing a number of people, but again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty is where you're going to find the show notes for this episode. Of course, all the different platforms are on, because if we happen to be deplatformed from one, you're going to be wondering, where the heck is Bolden and the TAC in this Path to Liberty? 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty is where you're going to find all the different platforms are on. But let's get right back to this. The Declaration then gets into the events of April 19th and General Gage's so-called peace offer, which, if you're like me, the idea of give up your natural rights, and I promise, wink, wink, that I'll let you have them back at some point. If you're like me, you're like the revolutionaries. You know this is an utter crock. Anyways, here's how they put it. By this perfidy, wives are separated from their husbands, children from their parents, the aged and the sick from their relations and friends, who wish to attend and comfort them, and those who have been used to live in plenty and even elegance are reduced to deplorable distress. So this is, hey man, you guys are like ripping families apart in order to enforce stuff you're not even authorized to do in the first place. And then to take our means of self-defense from us, also not authorized to do this. You are violent barbarians, really, is the mentality coming through to me. They go further. The general, further emulating his ministerial masters, by a proclamation bearing date on the 12th day of June, after venting the grossest falsehoods and calumnies against the good people of these colonies, proceeds to, quote, declare them all, either by name or description, to be rebels and traitors, to supersede the course of the common law, and instead thereof to publish and order the use and exercise of the law martial. So his proclamation on June 12, 1775, did make a peace offer, said, hey, we're going to stop the fighting. Make sure you give up your guns. But anyone who doesn't go, in case we have some problems, I'm declaring martial law on top of it. I mean, how do you trust someone like this? But here, from a little quote from that on June 12, 1775. This will also be linked to in the show notes. I do hereby, in His Majesty's name, offer and promise His most gracious pardon to all persons who shall forthwith lay down their arms and return to their duties of peaceable subjects, excepting only from the benefit of such pardon Samuel Adams and John Hancock, whose offenses are of too flagitious a nature to admit any other consideration than that of condign punishment. Man, if you've got thousands and thousands of people fighting against your empire, who are being oppressed by your empire, and you tell them all you got to do is turn in these two guys, Samuel Adams and John Hancock, give up your guns, give up your friends, we'll give you our version of peace. And what a surprise, the response was no deal. Jefferson, Dickinson, and the entire Continental Congress, this is from my article over the weekend, knew all too well how gun grabbers work. Gage had made a similar promise previously, but went back on his word. I mean, even before the time of social media, it got out pretty quickly that Gage had made a very similar offer and said, okay, lay down your arms just temporarily. The fighting can stop. You can get out of this siege and everything will be great. But then he didn't give the guns back. I'll give you the guns back, but then he never did. And continuing from the article, shortly after the siege of Boston began, Gage ordered all residents to turn their firearms in temporarily. After nearly 2,700 were turned in, the guns were never returned to them, and many of those promised with safe passage out of the city were even prohibited from leaving. So we'll give you safe passage, just give up your gun, we'll give them back to you. And then he's just a big scammer, just like all gun grabbers. They're just liars. They're willing to do whatever they want. And here from the Declaration, they made pretty clear that they knew what happened. They knew that the fix was in. The inhabitants of Boston, being confined within that town by the general, their governor, a governor general, and having, in order to procure their dismission, entered into a treaty with him. They saw it as a treaty, an agreement between the people of this colony, legally binding, not just some dude with power saying, I'll just say whatever I want, just like what politicians do. I'll say what they want to hear and then go back on it. And then too bad, you'll forget about it in 40 years. And who cares? I'll say a bunch of other stuff and make a bunch of other promises and then go back on that as well. That's what these people have always done. That's what they do today, all the time. We should never trust people with power, ever, including the people who say don't trust anyone with power. John Adams is a great example of that. Side note. So, in order to procure their dismission, entered into a treaty with him. It was stipulated that the said inhabitants, having deposited their arms with their own magistrates, should have liberty to depart, taking with them their other effects. They accordingly delivered up their arms, but in open violation of honor, in defiance of the obligation of treaties, which even savage nations esteemed sacred. They could make a treaty with people they considered savage nations, and they were more reliable than Governor and General Thomas Gage. He said the governor ordered the arms deposited as aforesaid, that they might be preserved for their owners, but to be seized by a body of soldiers, detained the greatest part of the inhabitants of the town, and compelled the few who were permitted to retire to leave their most valuable effects behind. So basically, hey, I promise you can get out of here, but nope, you can't. Just a few people can get out, but you're going to have to lose all of your property. So they knew the fix was in. But the force and beauty of these last paragraphs, which I mentioned before, primarily written by Jefferson, from my understanding, other people might correct me. I don't know the kind of nitty-gritty behind-the-scenes stuff that went down, but I have read a little bit about it. The force and beauty of the Declaration's closing paragraphs still have remarkable impact today. Quote, "We are reduced to the alternative of choosing an unconditional submission to the tyranny of irritated ministers or resistance by force." So it's a horrible situation. Either you are in total submission because they claim total power and they're using it in worse and worse ways, or at some point you resist by force. And they said the latter is our choice. Honor, justice, and humanity forbid us tamely to surrender that freedom which we received from our gallant ancestors and which our innocent posterity have a right to receive from us. Samuel Adams had had a number of statements about this in the early 1770s as well. Because if we tamely submit, we involve future generations unborn in this doom. And the notion that it's okay to say, I can give up my liberty today, maybe I'll pass away in 10 years, and, the next generation will figure it out. That's not what an honorable people is supposed to do. And the founding generation, Brian McClanahan refers to them as the real greatest generation. I absolutely agree with him. The old revolutionaries, without a doubt, they were men among men. They thought that honor, no matter how much the odds were stacked against them, their honor made it clear that they could never give up their liberty, because if they did that, then millions unborn would be stuck with their crappy decision. I don't know what better way to put it. Here from my article, it was understood that giving up at this point would lead to terrible results, and the revolutionaries would continue their resistance no matter how much the odds were stacked against them. Quote, "The arms we have been compelled by our enemies to assume, we will, in defiance of every hazard, with unabating firmness and perseverance, employ for the preservation of our liberties, being with one mind resolved to die freemen rather than live slaves. So this is the standard live free or die mentality. Give me liberty or give me death. This is the mentality. It wasn't just of a few individuals. This was a kind of a prevailing opinion. At one point, we have to have firmness and perseverance, resolved to fight to the death to defend our sacred liberty. And then the declaration closed with an assertion of the right of the people to continue resisting British attacks on their natural rights through the force of arms. And here's how they put it. In our own native land, in defense of the freedom that is our birthright, and which we ever enjoyed till the late violation of it, for the protection of our property, acquired solely by the honest industry of our forefathers and ourselves, against violence actually offered, we have taken up arms. We shall lay them down when hostilities shall cease on the part of the aggressors, and all danger of their being renewed shall be removed, and not before. So the declaration here is basically, it's a line in the sand to the British, as I was mentioning earlier. They weren't saying, okay, let's work out a deal. It's totally the other end of the spectrum. You are aggressors. When you back down and all danger of you ever doing this again, then we'll stop fighting. But until that, no deal ever. We're not giving up our guns. We aren't giving up our friends, and we aren't giving up our right, our natural right to resist the freedom that is our birthright. Now, it's not terribly difficult, I wrote, to understand the thinking behind the declaration of causes and necessity of taking up arms. For over a decade, the colonists endured the tyranny of the British, who unilaterally and arbitrarily exercised powers that violated the very foundations of liberty that they cherished for generations. So this was, at some point, they were going to say, enough is enough. And if you think about it, when the people pleaded for reason, the British just tightened their grip. When the people resisted primarily through noncompliance, the British sent fleets and armies to enforce their edicts. When the people still refused to submit, the British started implementing a massive gun control scheme. And when the British came to take the arms and the powder, the people were left with no other choice, and they fought back. They're absolute heroes, and this is essential information that is almost totally ignored in the government-run school system. They don't like teaching people about resisting government power, and they don't like people seeing the parallels between what they went through then and what we go through today, even though we don't have the strength and numbers in the foundational principle and support. And that's why it's so essential. I believe it's so essential for us to reach and teach more and more people with this type of historical information, the real truth, the history behind the stuff that they ignore all the time. And nothing helps us do this work more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I'd be extremely grateful for any consideration you can give to joining us today. You can also make a one-time donation over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. And while I'm here, I want to take a quick moment and say a huge thank you to just a handful of the many people who have joined us as members lately. I really appreciate your support. There's Sandra in New Jersey, Jerry in Arizona, William in Texas, Edward in New York, Teresa in Pennsylvania, and Aaron in Wisconsin. I'm extremely grateful for you putting your financial faith behind our work. I'm grateful for you spending some of your time with me here today. Again, I hope you had a great Independence Day week. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope it made you think. I hope you learned something. Of course, we'll have this published for the blog post over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty so you can read more in context. You can read that whole document. It's not super long, and it's not super difficult reading either. Plus, we'll have articles and episodes for you to check out as well. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Again, I really appreciate you spending some of your time with me today. I'll look over the comments in the live chat and especially in the archive over the next couple of hours this afternoon. So I do read through all your feedback, your emails at team@10thamendmentcenter.com as well, all spelled out. If you've got suggestions for future episodes, I get a lot of great ideas from your feedback. I don't get to respond to maybe even 10% of the stuff that I see, but I get a lot of great stuff and feedback, sometimes good, sometimes bad, and all very helpful. So thank you very much again. Appreciate you being here. Hope you have a great day. Hope you enjoyed the episode, and hope to see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.